Pregnant, abandoned, and accused of a crime she never committed, Elena lost everything in one night. But when the world expected her to disappear, she rose from heartbreak with the truth in her hands. This story teaches us that betrayal may break the heart, but courage can rebuild a life. Please support our channel with one like and one share for more powerful stories. Thanks for watching.
The phone rang 3 times. My husband looked at the screen, saw my name, and declined the call. He didn't know I was in the back of a car, bleeding out. 8 months pregnant with twins, alone and terrified in a Manhattan storm. He didn't know that while he was celebrating a $2 billion deal, doctors were telling me they might have to choose between saving me or saving my babies. He found out 14 hours later, and when he finally showed up, he said, "I should have just called an ambulance instead of being dramatic." Dramatic. I almost died. Our babies almost died. And he said I was being dramatic. But the part that really broke me, I found emails on his computer between him and his mother from before we were even married. They called me the incubator. They were planning to replace me before I even walked down the aisle. 3 months later, he sent police to take my children. He forged medical records, paid off judges, ruined my name. He thought I would crumble. But he forgot one very important thing about me. Before I was his wife, before I was a mother, before I was anything he tried to make me, I was a forensic accountant. And forensic accountants? We find what powerful men try to hide. This is the story of how I lost it all: my babies, my money, my reputation, my name. And it is also the story of how I burned his entire empire to the ground. But I have to warn you, there is a twist at the end that even I never saw coming. A secret that changes absolutely everything. So stay until the very end, because the ending will shock you. My name is Elena Shaw, and this is how I survived. The phone on the mahogany table vibrated 3 times, the screen flashing one word: Elena. Daniel Shaw's jaw tightened. His finger paused for a single second before pressing the red decline button. He had no clue that was the last time his wife would try to reach him before their world imploded. He did not know that while he was securing a $2 billion deal, his pregnant wife was bleeding in a car, alone and terrified. He thought he was building a legacy. Instead, he was handing his entire world over to the one man he hated most. This is the story of a CEO who lost everything in a single moment of silence, and how his wife found everything he never gave her. The rain in Manhattan that Tuesday was not just rain. It was a flood, turning the gray city into a blurred painting of charcoal and steel. Inside the climate-controlled sanctuary of Shaw Industries' boardroom, the storm did not matter. The only pressure in that room came from Daniel Shaw. At 36, Daniel was the youngest titan in tech and logistics. Sharp jaw, perfectly tailored charcoal suit, and eyes that could dismantle a person's confidence in seconds. Today, he was on the hunt. "The valuation is incorrect," Daniel said, his voice low but cutting. He did not look at the papers. He stared directly at the trembling CEO of the firm he was about to acquire. "You are bleeding cash in your Europe-Asia division. If I walk away, Kalinowski Global eats you alive. And we both know Roman Kalinowski does not do mergers. He does eviscerations." The mention of Roman Kalinowski stiffened everyone's spine. Kalinowski was the phantom haunting Daniel. Where Daniel was new money and aggressive, Roman was old money, rough-edged and unpredictable. They had been rivals since their MBA program at Wharton, a feud that had graduated to the stock exchange. Daniel's phone lit up again. Incoming call. Elena, with a heart emoji. His eyes glanced at the screen for just a fraction of a second, annoyance tightening his jaw. Elena was 8 months pregnant with twins and on strict bed rest at their Greenwich estate. She should not be calling him during the most important meeting of the quarter. He ignored it. "Daniel." "Maybe you should take that," his lawyer, Arthur Whitmore, whispered. Arthur was one of the few who knew Elena's pregnancy was high risk. "We're closing." Daniel hissed, his gaze fixed on the other CFO. Elena knows the schedule. She's probably calling about nursery paint colors. It can wait. It could not. 5 miles away, Elena Shaw was not in Greenwich. She was in a black town car, clutching her stomach, gasping for breath. She was pale, drenched in a cold sweat, her dark hair plastered to her forehead. "Driver, please," she gasped, the pain radiating from her lower back to her stomach like a hot poker. "How much further?" "Traffic is gridlocked, Mrs. Shaw." The storm. The driver's panicked eyes met hers in the rearview mirror. "I can try to get to Mount Sinai, but we are not moving." Elena looked at her phone. Call declined. Hot tears stung her eyes. She was not calling about paint. She was calling because she felt something tear inside her. She was calling because she had disobeyed her doctors for a reason Daniel would never understand. She had found the financial reports on Daniel's private server. She knew he was risking it all just to crush Roman Kalinowski, and that a failed deal meant a federal investigation. She was on her way to Roman's office to ask for a truce, to beg him to back off the bidding war for her husband's sake. A foolish, desperate move, born from a love Daniel had stopped deserving years ago. Her phone buzzed, a text from her college roommate, Jessica Torres. "Mel visiting today? Need me to fake an emergency? I have a great your car is on fire voice." Elena almost smiled through the pain. But then, another contraction hit so hard her vision went white. The driver swerved toward the curb. "Ma'am, you need a hospital right now." Elena nodded weakly, but even then, she looked at her phone one more time. Call declined. She had ignored the warning signs for years. The canceled anniversaries, the phone always face down, the passwords that changed every month. When your gut whispers, you are supposed to listen. Hers had been screaming for years, and she had just covered her ears. Now, alone in a car in a Manhattan storm, 8 months pregnant with twins, who might not make it through the next hour, Elena Shaw finally understood. She was completely on her own. She had always been on her own. And if she was going to survive this, she had to stop waiting for her husband to come and save her. The town car lurched to a halt outside an emergency entrance. It was not Mount Sinai. It was not the private facility where she had a delivery plan. It was a county hospital, with buzzing fluorescent lights and a waiting room filled with strangers. But it was close, and close was all that mattered. The driver helped her out of the car. A nurse saw her immediately, took one look at the blood pooling by her feet, and screamed for a gurney. "Ma'am," the nurse said, Are you alone? Where is the father?" Elena glanced at her phone one last time. 3 missed calls. No answer. "He's in a meeting," Elena whispered as they rushed her away. "He is always in a meeting." The last thing she saw before they wheeled her through the double doors was her phone. "Daniel Shaw has declined your call." And across the city in a gleaming boardroom, her husband was popping champagne. He had won his deal. He had no idea what he had just lost. The emergency room was chaos. Fluorescent lights buzzed, a child cried, and the air smelled of antiseptic and old coffee. Elena barely noticed. The pain was a living thing now, a creature with claws tearing her apart from the inside. She gripped the gurney rails so hard her knuckles were white. "Ma'am, I need you to tell me your name." A young nurse was running beside her, clipboard in hand. She had kind eyes and a steady voice. "Elena Shaw," she managed to say through clenched teeth. "Elena Mercer Shaw." "Okay, Elena, I need an emergency contact." "Who should we call?" "My husband. Daniel Shaw. His number is in my phone." The nurse took the phone from Elena's trembling hand and dialed. It just rang and rang. No answer. She tried again. Same thing. "Is there anyone else we can call, Elena?" Elena squeezed her eyes shut. The contractions were coming one after another, waves of agony that left her gasping. She thought of her mother, dead 3 years. Her father estranged since she married Daniel. Her sister, out in California. There was only one other person. "Jessica Torres," Elena whispered. Speed dial 2. She is my lawyer, my friend. She will come. The nurse made the call. This time, someone picked up on the first ring. What happened? Is Elena okay? I am getting in my car right now. Jessica's voice was loud enough for Elena to hear. Just tell me where. County General, the nurse said. Maternity emergency. How fast can you get here? 40 minutes. Maybe 30 if I break a few laws. Tell her I am coming. Tell her she is not alone. The nurse hung up and squeezed Elena's hand. Help is coming, she said. Now let's get you into delivery. But as they wheeled her toward the operating room, Elena's phone buzzed again. It wasn't a call this time. It was a notification from Daniel's social media. Shaw Industries secures landmark $2 billion acquisition. And the photo showed Daniel, grinning, holding champagne, surrounded by executives in expensive suits. And right there, at the edge of the frame, was a woman with bright red lipstick and perfectly styled blonde hair. Her hand was resting on Daniel's arm, a little too comfortably. Victoria Lane, his executive assistant, Elena, just stared at the photo as the gurney rattled through the doors. She stared at how Victoria looked at her husband. She stared at how Daniel wasn't looking at his phone, and something inside her, something that had been hanging by a thread for years, finally snapped. The delivery was brutal, an emergency C-section. The twins were too early, too small, and so fragile. Lucas came first, silent for a terrifying 30 seconds before he finally cried. Then came Lily, even smaller, her skin tinted blue. Through a fog of drugs and fear, Elena watched doctors work on her babies. She couldn't move, couldn't speak. She could only watch and pray to a God she wasn't sure she believed in anymore. The twins survived, but just barely. They were rushed to the NICU, hooked up to machines, their tiny bodies fighting for every single breath. Elena survived too, but just barely. She'd lost too much blood, and her blood pressure had soared. The doctors kept using words like lucky and miracle, but Elena didn't feel lucky. She just felt alone. She woke up 14 hours later in a private room. Her throat felt raw, her body was a map of pain, and sitting in the chair beside her bed, holding her hand, was not her husband. It was Jessica Torres. "Hey you," Jess said softly. Her eyes were red like she'd been crying, but her voice was strong. "Welcome back to the land of the living." "The babies?" Elena croaked. "They're fighters. Just like their mom." Jess squeezed her hand. "They're in the NICU, but they're stable. The doctors say they're going to be okay." Elena let out a breath she felt like she'd been holding for months. "And Daniel?" Jess's face changed. Something dark crossed her eyes before she hid it. "He's here," Jess said, choosing her words carefully. "He got here about an hour ago." 14 hours, Elena whispered. "It took him 14 hours. Elena, there's something you need to know before you see him." But before Jess could finish, the door swung open. Daniel Shaw walked in like he owned the room, which of course he did. He owned everything. He was wearing a fresh suit, no wrinkles, no sign that he'd been pacing in a waiting room or crying in a hospital chapel. He looked like he had just stepped out of a board meeting, and Elena realized with a sickening lurch in her stomach that he probably had. "Elena," Daniel said, his voice clipped, almost annoyed. "You should have called an ambulance instead of trying to come into the city. What were you thinking?" "I did call," Elena said slowly. "I called you 3 times. You declined everyone." Daniel's jaw tightened. "I was closing the biggest deal of my career. You know how important that was. I was dying, Daniel. Our babies almost died." "But you didn't," he said, as if that settled it. "And the babies are fine. The doctor said so. So let's not be dramatic about this." Elena stared at the man she had married, the man she'd given up her career for, the man whose children she had just nearly died to bring into this world. And she realized with a strange, peaceful clarity that she didn't recognize him at all. "I know about Victoria," she said quietly. Daniel froze. His face went blank for just 1 second before the mask snapped back on, harder this time, colder. You went through my things? It wasn't a denial. It wasn't an apology. It was anger at being caught. I saw the photo, Daniel, from your celebration. She was standing right next to you, her hand on your arm, while I was bleeding out on an operating table. Daniel was quiet for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice was flat and clinical, like he was explaining a quarterly report. Elena, let's be realistic. You were a stepping stone, the house, the cards, the lifestyle that's my gift to you. Victoria understands ambition. You understand casseroles. Elena felt like he had slapped her. We'll divorce after you recover, Daniel continued. You'll get visitation. The twins stay with me. Shaws do not split custody. You can't do that. Watch me. Daniel straightened his tie. I have lawyers you've never even heard of. I have judges who owe me favors. You can fight if you want, Elena, but you will lose. You'll lose the kids, you'll lose the money, and you will lose whatever dignity you have left. He turned and walked to the door, then paused and looked back. Get some rest. You look terrible. The door clicked shut behind him. Elena sat in the hospital bed, all alone. Her body was broken, her heart was shattered, and her babies were fighting for their lives down the hall. She thought about what Daniel had said about casseroles, about stepping stones, about losing, and for the first time in her marriage, she didn't cry. You see, Daniel thought he had already won. He thought she was weak, helpless, and completely outmatched. But he had forgotten one very important thing. Before she was his wife, before she was a mother, before she was any of the things he had turned her into, Elena, Mercer had been one of the best forensic accountants in New York City. And forensic accountants know how to find things, hidden things, secret things, things that powerful men thought were buried forever. Jess, Elena said quietly, I need you to do something for me. Jess leaned forward. Anything. I need you to help me destroy him. Jess smiled a fierce, protective, beautiful smile. Girl, I didn't go to law school to watch you cry. I went to make men cry. Now tell me everything. And so, Elena did. 6 weeks after she almost died, Elena Shaw came home to a house that no longer felt like it was hers. The Greenwich mansion was just as she had left it, 14,000 square feet of white marble and designer furniture. A nursery painted in the soft yellow she'd picked out herself. A walk-in closet full of clothes Daniel had to approve before she bought them. She hadn't noticed before how everything in this house was about his permission. Ladies, let me tell you something I wish someone had told me years ago. When you need permission to buy your own clothes, to see your own friends, to breathe your own air, that isn't a marriage. That is a prison with a diamond ring. The twins came home 3 weeks after they were born. Still small, but healthy. Lucas had his father's dark hair and stubborn jaw. Lily had Elena's eyes, brown and watchful, taking in the world with an intensity that seemed too old for a baby. Elena held them every chance she got. She fed them at 2 a.m., and 4 a.m., and 6 a.m. She sang them the old lullabies her mother used to sing before cancer took her. She memorized their weight in her arms, the soft sounds of their breathing, the way Lucas's little fist curled when he dreamed. Because she knew Daniel would try to take them. And she knew she would burn the world to the ground before she let him. During the day, while Daniel was at work and a nanny helped with the babies, Elena conducted her own investigation. She was methodical, careful, and patient. She screenshotted every email she could get into. She photographed every receipt she found in his pockets. She recorded every conversation when he didn't know she was listening. New York is a one-party consent state. She had done her homework. Now write this down. One-party consent. Look up your own state's laws. Because the conversation you record today might be the evidence that saves your life tomorrow. And slowly, piece by piece, she started to build a picture of her husband's real life. The affair with Victoria had been going on for 2 years. There were hotel receipts from times Elena thought Daniel was at conferences, jewelry purchases that never made it into her jewelry box, and text messages that made her stomach turn. In the messages, he called Victoria my real wife and Elena the incubator. The incubator, that's what she was to him. A vessel for producing his heirs, nothing more. But the affair wasn't even the worst of it. The worst part was what she found on his private server. Jess just stared at the laptop screen, her mouth hanging open. This is $47 million, Elena. $47 million in offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands. Accounts that were never disclosed in your prenup or your joint tax returns. Elena nodded. She had spent 3 sleepless nights tracing the money, surviving on nothing but coffee and rage. I found the access codes in his home office. He keeps them on a piece of paper taped to the bottom of his desk drawer. He never thought I'd look there because he thinks I'm too stupid to understand finances. Jess whistled low. This isn't just grounds for divorce, honey. This is tax fraud, money laundering, maybe worse. There's more, Elena said quietly. She clicked on another file, her hand trembling on the mouse. This was the part that still made her feel physically sick. It was an email chain between Daniel and his mother, Margaret Shaw. The emails went back nearly 3 years. Before Elena and Daniel were even married. Jess read them out loud, her voice getting harder with each sentence. Victoria is perfect. Ambitious but controllable. Far better breeding than that Mercer girl. She paused. Did your mother-in-law just call you a broodmare? Keep reading. Once Elena has served her purpose, we can arrange for Daniel to move on. Victoria will give the family heirs with proper bloodlines. The Mercer girl can be paid off. She has no family connections worth preserving. Her mother is dead. Her father is a drunk. No one will fight for her. Jess put the laptop down, her hands shaking now too. Your mother-in-law has been planning your replacement since before your wedding. Since before my wedding, Elena confirmed. And Daniel has been playing along the entire time. Every kiss, every I love you, every time he held my hand at dinner parties. All of it was a performance? I was auditioning for a role I had already lost. They sat in silence for a moment, looking out the window of Jess's small apartment. The sun was setting over Manhattan. Orange light spilled across the floor like liquid fire. Elena thought about her wedding day, the white dress, the vows, the way Daniel had looked at her and said, forever. He had already been planning to get rid of her. So, what do we do? Elena asked finally. Jess leaned back in her chair. She was still wearing her courtroom clothes, a navy suit that made her look like she could argue with God and win. We have 3 options, Jess said. 1, we file for divorce right now. Hit him with everything we have, and hope we can get to a sympathetic judge before his lawyers bury us. And the downside? He has more money, more connections, and more time. He will drag this out for years. Your kids will be in high school before you get a final ruling, and by then, they will have been raised to believe their mother is crazy. Option 2. We take this to the feds. Report the offshore accounts, the tax fraud, everything. Let the government do the heavy lifting. Elena frowned. But then, I lose control, and if he is indicted, the assets get frozen. I could end up with nothing. The kids could end up with nothing. Exactly. Which brings us to option 3. Jess smiled that fierce, protective smile that Elena had come to rely on. We play his game. We stay quiet. We keep gathering evidence. And when we have enough to guarantee victory, we strike so hard and so fast that he never sees it coming. How long would that take? 6 months, Jess said. Maybe a year. Long enough for you to secure your own finances. Long enough for me to find every skeleton in his closet. Long enough for him to get comfortable. Make mistakes. Let his guard down. Elena thought about Lucas and Lily, thought about holding them in the hospital, not knowing if they would survive. She thought about Daniel walking in 14 hours late, more annoyed than worried, complaining that the traffic had ruined his dinner reservation. She thought about the next year. 12 months of pretending. 12 months of sleeping next to a man who saw her as a stepping stone. 12 months of smiling while her heart turned to stone. Could she do it? Could she lie that long? She looked at the laptop screen. At the words, "No one will fight for her." They were wrong. Option 3, Elena said, "But I want him to feel it, Jess. I do not just want to win. I want him to lose everything. His money, his reputation, his precious family name. I want him to know it was me, the Mercer girl he thought had no family connections worth preserving." Jess reached across the table and took her hand. "Then, let us get to work." Over the next 6 months, Elena became two people. During the day, she was the dutiful wife. She attended Daniel's corporate events with a practiced smile. She hosted dinner parties for his investors. She nodded politely when Margaret made cutting remarks about her cooking or her clothes or her lack of proper social connections. She learned to swallow her rage like medicine. Bitter, necessary, temporary. At night, when Daniel was asleep or away with Victoria, she was a detective. She traced shell companies through Delaware and Nevada. She cataloged every wire transfer to the Cayman accounts. She built spreadsheets, cross-referencing Daniel's calendar with hotel charges and with Victoria's Instagram check-ins. She even found credit card statements he thought were hidden. Here is a tip that saved me. Instagram check-ins. When your husband says he is at a conference in Chicago, but his mistress is posting poolside photos in Miami, those timestamps do not lie. Screenshots, ladies. Screenshots of everything. And she found something else, something that changed everything. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, it had been Elena's obstetrician throughout her pregnancy. She was a formidable woman in her 60s with silver hair and the kind of calm authority that came from delivering over 3,000 babies. She had seen everything, which is why when Elena called her to request copies of her medical records, Dr. Mitchell's noticed something strange. "Elena," the doctor said carefully, "I am looking at your file right now. Some of these notes do not match my handwriting." "What do you mean?" "There is a notation here from the night you delivered. It says you refused treatment and exhibited paranoid behavior, that you were combative with staff and demonstrated symptoms consistent with postpartum psychosis." "Elena, I never wrote that. I was not even on shift that night. I was at my daughter's wedding in Boston." Elena's blood went cold. "Someone altered my records. It appears so, and whoever did it had access to our hospital system. This is serious, Elena. I need to report this to administration." "No," Elena said quickly. "Not yet. Can you give me a few days?" There was a long pause. "Whatever you are dealing with," Dr. Mitchell said finally, "be careful. Whoever did this has resources, and they are clearly willing to do whatever it takes to hurt you. This is not amateur hour. This is calculated, planned." Elena thanked her and hung up. Then she called Jess. "He is setting a trap," Elena said, her voice shaking. "Altered medical records. He is going to claim I am mentally unstable, that I am a danger to the babies." "Then we need to move faster," Jess replied. "How close are we to having everything?" "Another month, maybe 2. "You might not have 2 months, Elena." Elena looked at her babies sleeping peacefully in their crib. Lucas had his fist curled against his cheek. Lily was making soft sounds in her sleep, dreaming baby dreams. She thought about what Dr. Mitchell said, calculated, planned. This was not a divorce, this was a war. And Daniel had been preparing the battlefield for years. "Whatever happens," Elena whispered, "they are not taking my children." "Then let us make sure they cannot," Jess said. "It is time to file." The next morning, Elena walked into the courthouse and filed for divorce. The paperwork was 43 pages long. It documented the affair, the hidden assets, the offshore accounts, the altered medical records, the emails calling her the incubator, everything. She handed it to the clerk with steady hands. This was the opening shot in a war she had been preparing for months. And for exactly 6 hours, Elena felt like she was winning. She went home. She held her babies. She allowed herself to imagine a future where she was free. Then Daniel came home with the police. And Elena learned that no matter how carefully you plan, there is always someone who has been planning longer. The police car pulled into the driveway at 6:47 in the evening. Elena remembered the exact time because she was feeding Lily when she saw the lights through the nursery window, blue and red flashing in the autumn darkness, painting the white walls of her perfect house in colors that meant nothing good. Her first thought was that something had happened to Daniel, an accident on the highway, a heart attack at the office. Her second thought, the one that made her stomach drop and her arms tighten around her daughter, was that this was not an accident at all. Daniel stepped out of the cruiser's passenger seat. He was wearing his most concerned expression, the one he used when reporters asked about company layoffs or environmental violations. Practiced, perfect, completely empty. 2 officers followed him up the walkway. They were not smiling. Elena handed Lily to the nanny, her hands suddenly trembling. "Stay with the babies," she said quietly. "Do not let them out of your sight. No matter what happens, no matter what you hear." She met Daniel and the officers at the front door. "Elena," Daniel said, his voice dripping with false sympathy. "I did not want it to come to this. I tried everything else, but you left me no choice." "What is happening?" she demanded. "Why are there police at our house?" One of the officers stepped forward. He was young, maybe 30, with the uncomfortable look of someone who did not want to be here. "Ma'am, we have a court order for emergency custody removal." The words did not make sense. Elena heard them, processed them, but they would not connect to anything real. "Emergency custody?" she repeated. "Of my children?" The officer nodded. "We have documentation indicating you may pose a risk to your children's safety." The order was signed by Judge Harrison this afternoon. Judge Harrison. Elena knew that name. He was the judge who golfed with Daniel every third Sunday. The judge whose campaign Daniel had funded 3 years running. The judge who had been to their house for Christmas parties. "This is insane," Elena said. "I have never harmed my children. I would never harm my children. I almost died giving birth to them. Ma'am." "I understand this is difficult." The officer's voice was gentle, but his hand was resting on his radio. "But we need to execute this order. If you interfere, I will have to arrest you." Daniel stepped closer, his voice pitched just loud enough for the officers to hear. "Elena has been struggling since the birth. Postpartum issues. She has been paranoid, erratic. I found her standing over the cribs at 3 in the morning, just staring at them. It scared me. I tried to get her help, but she refused. She says the doctors are conspiring against her." "That is a lie," Elena snapped. "He is lying. I was feeding them at 3 in the morning because that is what mothers do." "That is what mothers do, Mrs. Shaw," the second officer said. "We have medical records showing you refused treatment at the hospital, and a sworn statement from a psychiatrist, Dr. Whitman. He concluded you're experiencing postpartum psychosis with paranoid delusions." "I have never seen a psychiatrist named Dr. Whitman. I have never met him. I don't even know what he looks like." Daniel pulled out his phone, showing it to the officers. "See? This is the evaluation." The doctor concluded Elena is a danger to herself and the children. He recommended immediate intervention. Elena stared at the document. It had her name, her birth date, her address, even her signature, but she had never signed it. She'd never been evaluated. The altered hospital records, the fake psychiatric evaluation, the judge who played golf with her husband, it all clicked. This was a trap, built with the precision of a prison. "This is fabricated," she said desperately. "Someone changed my hospital records. My doctor can confirm it, Dr. Sarah Mitchell. She noticed the alterations herself. Just give me time to prove it. That's all I am asking. The officer shook his head. Ma'am, that's for the courts to decide. Right now, we have a valid order, and we need to execute it. Behind her, one of the babies started to cry. It was Lily. She always knew when something was wrong, sensing her mother's fear. Please, Elena whispered, her voice cracking. The word came out broken, desperate. Please don't do this. They're only 3 months old. They're still breastfeeding. They need me. For just a moment, she saw something flicker in the young officer's eyes, doubt, sympathy. A human recognition that something here was terribly wrong. His hand moved away from his radio. His shoulders softened. Then Daniel spoke again. Officers, I am genuinely concerned for her safety. Can we please just do this quickly before she gets more agitated? I don't want her to hurt herself. The moment passed. The officer's face hardened again, becoming professional, distant. Ma'am, I need you to step aside. We are taking the children now. What happened next would haunt Elena for the rest of her life. The officers went upstairs, their boots loud on the marble stairs, the same stairs where she had dreamed of watching her children take their first steps. The nanny, crying, handed over Lucas first. He was wrapped in the blue blanket Elena's mother had crocheted before she died. Then Lily. Lily was screaming now, reaching for her mother with tiny, desperate hands. Elena screamed. She begged. She tried to push past the officers. She had to grab her babies. One of them held her back not roughly, but firmly, immovably. Ma'am, please don't make this harder than it has to be. Harder? She watched her children being carried out of the nursery, down the stairs, and through the front door she'd walked through as a bride 4 years ago. Lucas was wailing now, too. That newborn cry that sounds like the end of the world, a cry hardwired into a mother's brain to be impossible to ignore. And Elena couldn't go to him. She couldn't hold him. She could only watch. You will regret this, she screamed at Daniel. I swear to God, you will regret this. They are my children. Mine. Daniel just shook his head sadly, turning to the officers with a look of practiced grief. This is exactly what I was talking about. The paranoid threats, the irrational behavior. Thank you for getting the children to safety. I'll make sure she gets the help she needs. The car doors slammed shut. The engine started. The lights, blue and red, disappeared down the driveway. Elena stood in the doorway of her empty house, her arms aching for children who were already gone. I need you to understand. They took my children right out of my arms while I screamed, until my throat was raw. The officers looked at me with pity, like I was crazy, like I was the danger. And Daniel stood there with his sad face and concerned voice, and everyone believed him. That's how good he was. That's how long he planned this. He didn't just want custody. He wanted me erased. And for 72 hours, I thought he'd won. The next 3 days were a blur of horror. Elena was served a restraining order. She couldn't come within 500 feet of her own home. Her bank accounts were frozen because of suspicious transfers she never made. Her credit cards were canceled. Her phone was cut off. In less than 3 days, she went from a Greenwich socialite to homeless and penniless. Jess took her in, of course, setting her up on a pull-out couch in her tiny Manhattan apartment. She made her eat soup and held her while she sobbed through the night. We're going to fix this, Jess said. This isn't over. But Elena couldn't hear her. All she could hear was Lucas crying. All she could see was Lily reaching for her. She kept checking the new phone Jess bought her, desperate for a message from the nanny, for any update. Nothing came. She didn't know if they were eating, if they were sleeping, if anyone was holding them when they cried. She didn't know if they'd even remember her voice. On the 4th day, Elena stopped crying. On the 5th day, she started thinking. On the 6th day, she picked up her phone and called a number she'd saved months ago. It rang twice. Hello? The voice was deep, gruff. "Mr. Callahan," Elena said, "my name is Elena Shaw. We met once at a pediatrician's office. You were there with your niece. You gave me your card and said if I ever needed help with anything at all, I should call." There was a long pause. "I remember you," Roman Callahan said slowly. "You're Daniel Shaw's wife. I was Daniel Shaw's wife. Now I'm the woman he's trying to destroy. He took my children, Mr. Callahan. He fabricated evidence to make me look insane. He has judges and police officers in his pocket." And I think she paused. Steadying her voice, "I think you might be the only person in this city who hates him enough to help me." Another pause. Elena could hear him thinking, weighing the risks. "Where are you?" Roman asked finally. "Manhattan. Staying with a friend. Stay there. Don't go anywhere. Don't talk to anyone. I'll come to you." He hung up. Elena put down the phone and looked at Jess, who had heard the whole thing. "Are you sure about this?" Jess asked. "Roman Callahan isn't known for charity work. He's a shark, Elena, just like Daniel. Maybe worse. They've been trying to destroy each other for years." "Maybe," Elena said, looking out at the Manhattan skyline. Somewhere out there, her babies were crying for her. But right now, a shark is exactly what I need. Roman Callahan arrived at Jess's apartment at 8 that evening. He wasn't what Elena expected. She'd seen photos of him, of course. The press loved the playboy billionaire who raced motorcycles and dated supermodels. But the man who walked through the door looked nothing like that. He was tall, over 6 feet, with broad shoulders and hands that looked like they had done real work at some point in his life. His dark hair had threads of gray at the temples. His face was weathered, tired, and carried a look that was almost grief. He wasn't wearing a suit, just jeans and a flannel shirt. And he was carrying a baby. Elena stared. The baby was maybe 2 years old, a little girl with wild curly hair and her father's gray eyes. She clung to Roman's neck, watching Elena suspiciously. "Sorry," Roman said, his voice rougher than on the phone. "My daughter, Grace. I don't leave her with strangers anymore." It was such an unexpected thing to say. Elena didn't know how to respond. She just stepped aside and let them in. "You mentioned your wife," Elena said carefully, as Roman sat down with Grace, still attached to him like a koala. "At the pediatrician's office, you said she passed away from cancer." Roman's face tightened. 3 years ago. Brain tumor. Grace was 6 months old when Claire died. "I'm so sorry." "Don't be." Roman's voice was flat. "It happens. Now, tell me what Daniel did to you." So, Elena told him everything. The ignored phone calls, the emergency delivery, the affair, the offshore accounts, the altered medical records, the police taking her children. Roman listened without interrupting. His face didn't change, but Elena saw his jaw getting tighter and tighter as she spoke. When she finished, the silence was heavy. Finally, Roman spoke. "He tried to crush you, publicly and permanently. That's his style. I've seen him do it to business rivals. I never thought he'd do it to his own wife. He did it because I fought back," Elena said. "I filed for divorce. I thought I had enough evidence to win." "You have plenty of evidence," Roman said. "But evidence doesn't matter when the judges are bought and the system is rigged. Daniel has spent 20 years building this kind of protection. When I've tried to move against him in business, every lawsuit vanished, every witness recanted. Then how do we beat him?" Roman looked at her, really looked at her, as if he was measuring something inside her. "We don't just fight him," Roman said. "We'll take him apart, piece by piece. We find everyone he's ever hurt, everyone he's betrayed, and we turn them against him. That could take months. It will take months." Roman shifted Grace to his other arm. The little girl was asleep on his shoulder. "Are you willing to do what it takes?" Elena thought about Lucas and Lily, about the sounds they made as the officers took them away. "I am willing to do whatever it takes." Roman nodded. "Then here's what I know. Daniel has enemies everywhere, including business partners he cheated. and employees he destroyed. But the key isn't the people he hurt, it's the people who are still close to him. Victoria, Elena said, his mistress. Possibly, but Victoria is a social climber. She'll stay loyal as long as she thinks Daniel is on top. We need someone with better access, someone who knows where the real skeletons are hidden. There is one person, Elena said slowly. She hesitated. It was a terrible, dangerous thought, but desperate times called for desperate measures. His mother, Elena, continued. Margaret. She's been manipulating Daniel for years. I have emails proving she orchestrated the affair, that she was planning my replacement before we were even married. But I think there's more. More how? Elena pulled up a file on her phone she had found just days before Daniel took the children. It was a transaction log from one of Daniel's accounts, but the pattern was all wrong. Look at these transfers, she said, handing the phone to Roman. Every month, a large sum moves from Shaw Industries to an offshore account of Daniel's, but then within 48 hours, most of it moves again, to a different account I can't trace. Roman studied the screen, his eyes narrowing. This isn't Daniel's pattern. He hoards money. He doesn't give it away. Unless he doesn't know it's happening, Elena said. You think his mother is stealing from him? I think his mother has been stealing from him for years. And if we can prove it, we can turn Daniel against the one person he has always trusted the most. Roman looked up from the phone. His expression changed. There was almost respect in his eyes now. You really were an accountant, he said. Forensic accountant, Elena corrected. We find what people try to hide. Roman smiled. It was a tired smile, but it was genuine. All right, Elena Shaw, we have a lot of work to do. But first, we need to get you in front of a judge who is not on Daniel's payroll. I know someone. A retired family court judge named Vivian Ashford. She's incorruptible. How do you know her? Roman's smile faded. Because she's the one who handled my custody case after Claire died. My in-laws tried to take Grace from me. They said I was too unstable to raise a child alone. Vivian saw right through them. She saved my daughter. Then call her, Elena said. Please. Roman nodded. He pulled out his phone with his free hand, the other still cradling his sleeping daughter. Dr. Ashford, Roman said into the phone, I have someone you need to meet. A woman whose children were taken by a man who bought the system. Elena couldn't hear the response, but she saw Roman's face relax slightly. Tomorrow morning, he said. 9 o'clock. We'll be there. He hung up and looked at Elena. Get some sleep, he said. Tomorrow we start fighting back for real. For the first time in weeks, Elena felt something other than despair. She felt hope. She should have known it wouldn't last. The meeting with Dr. Vivian Ashford changed everything. Vivian was 73 years old, sharp as a knife, and completely unimpressed by wealth or power. She'd served on the family court bench for 32 years before retiring. She'd seen every trick in the book, and she recognized Daniel's tricks immediately. This custody order is garbage, Vivian said, spreading the documents on her kitchen table. Judge Harrison signed it based on fabricated medical records and an evaluation from a doctor, disciplined twice for falsifying reports. I can have this thrown out in 72 hours. Elena stared at her. 72 hours? 48 if I call in some favors. Vivian smiled grimly. Harrison and I have history. He knows I know things about him, things that would end his career. But what about Daniel? He has resources, connections. So do I, Vivian said. I spent 3 decades building relationships with honest judges, honest lawyers, honest social workers. They don't all bow to money, Elena. Some of us still believe in the system. 3 days later, Elena walked into family court with Jess on one side and Roman on the other. The emergency custody order was challenged, the fabricated medical records were exposed, and Dr. Okonkwo testified that her notes had been altered without her knowledge. Judge Harrison, faced with the undeniable evidence of his corruption, removed himself from the case. A new judge was assigned, an older woman named Patricia Henley. She had never taken a dime from Daniel Shaw. At the temporary custody hearing, Jess presented everything: the affair, the offshore accounts, the altered records, the conspiracy. Daniel's lawyers scrambled. They objected, they delayed, they demanded more time. Judge Henley denied every motion. Based on the evidence presented, the judge announced, "I am modifying the custody arrangement immediately. Elena Shaw is granted temporary primary custody of the minor children, Lucas and Lily Shaw. Daniel Shaw is granted supervised visitation, pending a full investigation." Elena burst into tears. Supervised visitation for Daniel. Her children were coming home. The reunion happened that afternoon. Elena held Lucas first. He was so much bigger than she remembered, even though it had only been 3 weeks. He looked at her with confused recognition, then slowly relaxed into her arms. Then Lily, little Lily, reached for her mother before the social worker even finished handing her over. Elena held them both. She pressed her face into their hair and breathed in their smell. And she cried, "Mommy is here," she whispered. "Mommy is never leaving again." Roman watched from the corner of the room. His own daughter, Grace, was with a nanny, but Elena could see him thinking about her, thinking about how close he had come to losing her. "You did it," Jess said, squeezing Elena's shoulder. "You actually did it." And for one perfect moment, Elena believed it was over. She should have known better. The news broke 3 days later. Elena was at Roman's house, planning their next move against Daniel's business, when Jess called, her voice tight with barely controlled fury. "Turn on the news," Jess said. "Channel 7 now." Elena grabbed the remote. A news anchor was speaking with a kind of breathless excitement that meant ratings gold. Breaking news in the Shaw Industries scandal. A whistleblower has come forward with evidence that Roman Kalinowski, billionaire CEO of Kalinowski Global, allegedly fabricated documents to frame his business rival, Daniel Shaw. According to leaked files, Kalinowski and Shaw's estranged wife, Elena, manipulated financial records as part of a coordinated revenge scheme. Elena felt the blood drain from her face. The screen showed documents, spreadsheets, and emails, all of them fake, all of them designed to look like Elena and Roman had manufactured the offshore account evidence. Daniel was fighting back, and he was winning. The media storm was relentless. Within 24 hours, Elena's name was everywhere, not as a victim, but as a villain. "Scorned wife teams up with husband's rival," one headline screamed. "Fake documents expose custody fraud," declared another. Jess's phone rang off the hook. Her law firm was getting pressure to drop Elena as a client. The other partners were worried about the optics, about their reputation. "I am not dropping you," Jess said firmly. "They can fire me before I abandon you." But even as she said it, Elena could see the strain in her friend's face. This was costing Jess everything, and it was about to get worse. The second blow came the next morning. Elena was served with new papers, an emergency motion to reverse the custody modification. Daniel's lawyers argued that the media coverage proved Elena was waging a campaign of public harassment, that she was unstable and dangerous. The same Judge Henley who had helped Elena now looked at the media circus and hesitated. "Mrs. Shaw," the judge said carefully, "I have serious concerns about the environment these children are being raised in. The public nature of this conflict is not in their best interest." "Your Honor," Jess argued, "the media coverage is the result of my client's husband leaking fabricated documents. She is the victim here, not the aggressor. But the damage was done." Judge Henley, facing public pressure and worried about her own reputation, modified her previous order. Custody was reversed. Again. Elena watched the social workers take Lucas and Lily for the second time. Lily reached for her, crying. Elena reached back. She could smell her daughter's hair. She could not touch her. The third blow came that same afternoon. Elena was still at Jess's apartment, still in shock when her phone rang. It was Roman. Elena, Roman said, and his voice was wrong, broken in a way she had never heard before. They took Grace. What? Child Protective Services. Someone filed an anonymous complaint. They said my home was unsafe, that I was neglecting her. Roman's voice cracked. She is all I have left of Claire. She is all I have. Elena sat down heavily. The room was spinning. Daniel wasn't just coming for her anymore. He was coming for everyone who had helped her, burning the world down, to make sure she had no allies left. In 72 hours, she had lost custody again. Her name was destroyed, and the only person helping her had lost his child too. Daniel was not trying to win. He was trying to destroy everyone she loved, and she realized something else. Something that had been nagging her for weeks. This was not a divorce. This was war. And she had been fighting it like a small disagreement. It was time to fight for survival. The days after her world collapsed were the darkest of Elena's life. She stopped eating, sleeping, or doing anything but stare at photos of Lucas and Lily. She just watched videos of their first miles and listened to recordings of their little voices. Jess forced her to shower, made her drink water, and sat with her through the worst of the panic attacks. "You need to eat," Jess said, gently pushing a bowl of soup toward her. "I cannot," Elena whispered. "I cannot do anything. What is the point? The point is that your babies need their mother alive and fighting. Dying is not an option. Winning is. But we lost. We lost a battle." Jess gripped her hand. "We have not lost the war." On the 5th day, Roman appeared at Jess's door. He looked worse than Elena felt, unshaven, hollow-eyed, but under the exhaustion. Something else was burning, something dangerous. "I found something," Roman said. He was carrying a thick file folder. Daniel made a mistake. Elena looked up. It was the first time in days she had felt anything but despair. What kind of mistake? Roman spread the documents on the small kitchen table. "I've been tracking Daniel's finances for years," he explained, "looking for weak spots. He's careful, paranoid, but everyone slips up." He pointed to a series of wire transfers. "Look at this pattern. Every month money moves from Shaw Industries to an offshore account, in Daniel's name. That part we knew, but look what happens next. Within 48 hours, most of it moves again to a different account, one registered to a shell company in Switzerland." Elena leaned forward. "I saw that too. I couldn't trace where it went." "I can." Roman's voice was grim. "The shell company is called Ashford Holdings. It's owned by a trust, and the trustee is Margaret Shaw." Elena's breath caught. "She's stealing from him. Has been for years," Roman confirmed. "Nearly $200 million total. Daniel thinks he's rich. His mother has been bleeding him dry. But why?" "Control," Roman said. "Margaret doesn't want Daniel to succeed. She wants him to need her. As long as he thinks the company is fragile, he has to keep fighting, keep working, keep doing whatever she says." It was an elegant kind of cruelty. Margaret had built a kingdom using her own son as an unwitting pawn. But that wasn't the only discovery. "There's more," Roman continued. He pulled out another document. "This is a letter I found in my own company's files from 8 years ago." Elena took the paper. It was a legal communication, the kind that companies send back and forth during negotiations. But one paragraph was highlighted. She read it out loud. "Per our agreement, Dr. Marcus Whitman will provide evaluations as needed for custody proceedings. Fees to be directed through Ashford Holdings." "Dr. Whitman," Elena repeated. "That's the psychiatrist who wrote my evaluation, the one saying I was psychotic." "The same one," Roman confirmed. "Margaret has been using him for years. Whenever someone threatens her position, she pays Whitman to declare them unstable." "This is incredible," Jess breathed. "This connects Margaret directly to the fraud. If we can prove she paid him to falsify your evaluation, We can take down the whole house of cards," Elena finished. For the first time in days, she felt something stir inside her. It wasn't hope, exactly. It was something darker, more focused. "We need more," Elena said. "We need to get inside Margaret's records, her personal files. The stuff she keeps hidden." "That's going to be hard," Jess said. "She's paranoid. Everything is locked down." "Not everything," Elena said slowly, as a terrible idea began to form. A brilliant, terrible idea. "There is one person who has access. One person Margaret trusts." "Who?" Roman asked. "Victoria Lane," Elena said. "Daniel's mistress. She's been working as his executive assistant for 3 years. She has access to everything." Roman frowned. "Victoria is loyal to Daniel. Why would she help us?" "Because Daniel is not loyal to Victoria." Elena pulled up her phone, showing them the email she had found months ago. The one between Daniel and Margaret planning Victoria's replacement. "Look at this," Elena said. "This is from 6 months ago. Daniel is already planning to trade Victoria for someone younger. The Henderson girl, 24 years old with better connections." Jess whistled low. "Victoria doesn't know?" "Victoria thinks she's going to be the next Mrs. Shaw. She has no idea she's just another stepping stone." Roman nodded slowly. "So we tell her. We show her the proof, and then we offer her a choice." "Exactly," Elena said. "She can help us take down Daniel and walk away clean. Or she can wait for Daniel to throw her away and end up with nothing." "It's risky," Jess warned. "If Victoria goes straight to Daniel, then we're no worse off than we are now," Elena said. "We've already lost everything. This is our last chance." Roman looked at her, really looked at her, the way he had that first night in Jess's apartment. "You've changed," he said quietly. "I had to," Elena replied. "The woman I was before, she let this happen. She let people walk all over her, trusted the wrong people, and ignored every single warning sign. That woman is gone." "Good," Roman said. "Because the woman you're becoming might actually win this thing." That night, Elena didn't sleep. But it wasn't despair that kept her awake this time. It was planning. She had been passive her entire marriage, just following Daniel's lead and accepting his decisions. She believed that love meant submission. No more. She started making lists. People who might help. Evidence they still needed. Weaknesses in Daniel's armor. By morning, she had a plan. It would demand perfect timing, absolute secrecy, and more courage than she'd ever had. But she was done being the victim. It was time to become the hero of her own story. The restaurant was expensive, the kind of place where a salad costs $40, and the waiters look right through you if your clothes aren't designer. Elena chose it deliberately. Victoria Lane would feel comfortable here, and wouldn't suspect a thing. Elena had dressed carefully, not too glamorous, but polished. She wanted Victoria to see her as an equal, not a threat. She arrived first, ordered sparkling water, and waited. Victoria walked in at exactly 12:30, wearing a white blouse and red lipstick, her blonde hair perfectly styled. She moved through the restaurant like she owned it, confident and poised. Then she saw Elena, and her confidence flickered. "You," Victoria said, stopping at the table. "What is this?" "Please sit down," Elena said calmly. "I promise this will be worth your time. If Daniel finds out I met with you..." "Daniel won't find out unless you tell him, in which case you will lose far more than I will." Something in Elena's voice made Victoria pause. She looked around the restaurant, then slowly sat down. "I am not here to threaten you," Elena continued. "I'm here to help you." Victoria laughed, a sharp, brittle sound. "Help me? You hate me. I should hate you. But right now, I need you. And you need me, even if you don't know it yet." Elena pulled out her phone and placed it on the table between them. 6 months ago, I found emails between Daniel and his mother. They were planning my replacement before we even got married. Margaret picked you. She thought you were ambitious but controllable. Better breeding than me. Victoria's eyes narrowed. Is that supposed to hurt me? I already know Margaret approves of me. I'm sure she told you that, Elena said. But did she tell you about the Henderson girl? The what? Elena swiped to the email and turned the phone so Victoria could read it. This is from 3 months ago. Daniel to Margaret. Victoria has served her purpose. Once the divorce is final, I'll find someone younger. She's pushing 30 and getting clingy. Victoria's face went pale. And this one, Elena continued, swiping again. Margaret's response. I have candidates. The Henderson girl is only 24 and far better connected. Less emotional, too. Victoria grabbed the phone, her hands trembling as she scrolled through the messages. Her lips moved silently as she read. This is fake, Victoria whispered. You know it's not. He told me he loved me. Victoria's voice cracked. He said we were the future. He told me that too. For 8 years. Elena kept her voice gentle but firm. I am not here to be your friend, Victoria. I'm here because you have information I need. And you have 2 choices. Victoria looked up, her mascara starting to smudge. You can help me destroy Daniel before he destroys you, Elena said. Or you can wait for him to replace you, just like he replaced me. And when that happens, you won't get a settlement. You won't get a goodbye. You will get nothing. How do I know you won't just throw me under the bus, too? Because I need you as a witness. Elena leaned forward. Help me take down Daniel and Margaret, and I'll make sure you walk away clean. I have a lawyer, a good one. She can work out immunity in exchange for your testimony. Victoria was quiet for a long moment. The restaurant buzzed around them, completely unaware of the deal being made at table 7. What do you need? Victoria finally asked. Everything, Elena said. Start with the real files, the ones Margaret keeps in her private safe. That evening, Victoria delivered. The documents were explosive. Financial records showing Margaret's systematic theft from Shaw Industries, emails proving she had orchestrated the affair, contracts with Dr. Whitman for fake psychiatric evaluations. And one more thing. A small detail that changed everything. There's a clause in the Shaw Industries charter, Roman said, reading through the papers. If the majority shareholder is convicted of fraud, their shares automatically transfer to a company-controlled trust. Meaning what? Elena asked. It means if we can get Margaret convicted, Daniel loses everything. Not just his reputation, but his actual ownership of the company. And who controls the trust? Roman looked up, his eyes bright. The board of directors, he said. A board I've been quietly building relationships with for the last 3 years. For the very first time, Elena let herself believe they might actually win, and over the next 2 weeks, the dominoes began to fall. First, Vivian Ashford confronted her son in public at a judicial conference. Judge Harrison was suspended while they investigated him for corruption. Then, the hospital's security footage surfaced, showing Margaret's assistant on Dr. Okonkwo's computer. The medical records fraud was exposed, and Dr. Whitman's license was revoked. Then Roman filed a formal whistleblower complaint with the SEC, not from Elena this time, but from himself, using his own company's investigation. The feds came for Margaret first. Elena watched the arrest live on television. Margaret Shaw, the matriarch of the Shaw family empire, was escorted from her home in handcuffs. She looked furious, confused like she couldn't believe this was happening to someone like her. Daniel was next. His accounts were frozen, his board members stopped taking his calls, and his lawyer started pushing plea deals. Through it all, Elena waited. She wanted more than just a victory. She wanted Daniel to know that it was her. She wanted him to understand the woman he dismissed as a casserole maker had brought down his entire world. Her opportunity came 3 weeks later at the Shaw Industries annual charity gala, a black tie event with 500 guests, including every major business leader in New York. Daniel would be there, trying to keep up the facade of power, even as his life crumbled around him. And Elena would be there too, with the final nail for his coffin. The gala was held at the Metropolitan Club, one of Manhattan's oldest and most exclusive venues. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm glow on marble floors as waiters in white gloves served champagne. The city's elite mingled in designer gowns and perfectly tailored tuxedos. Daniel Shaw stood near the main entrance, shaking hands and smiling, pretending that everything was just fine. He'd lost 15 pounds in the last month. His suit hung a little loose, and his eyes looked hollow, but he was still performing, still putting on the show, until Elena walked in. She wore a deep burgundy gown she'd bought with money from her new job. Roman offered to pay, but she refused. This night was going to be completely hers. Jess was at her side. Victoria hovered near the back. Victoria was ready to disappear if needed, and Roman was already inside, speaking quietly with the board chairman. The whole room noticed Elena the moment she entered. Whispers rippled through the crowd. Everyone knew the story, the scorned wife, the bitter custody battle, the accusations flying back and forth. What they didn't know was why she was here. Daniel saw her from across the room, and his jaw tightened. "Elena," he said, stalking toward her, his fury barely contained. "What do you think you're doing here?"
"I was invited," Elena said calmly, "by the board."
"Board? The board doesn't have the authority to—" "Actually, we do, Mr. Shaw," the chairman interrupted, appearing at Daniel's elbow. "We need you at the front of the room. We have an announcement to make." Daniel's confusion was almost funny. He glanced between Elena and the chairman, trying to figure out what he'd missed. For once in his life, he couldn't see the trap closing around him. The room fell silent as the chairman took the microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us. I know there have been many rumors about Shaw Industries. I'm here to address them." The screens around the room flickered on. Daniel's face appeared next to SEC investigation documents and Margaret's arrest photo. "Over the past month," the chairman continued, "we have discovered systematic fraud at the highest levels of our organization. Margaret Shaw has been arrested for embezzling over $200 million. Additionally, CEO Daniel Shaw is under investigation for tax fraud, money laundering, and falsifying legal documents." Gasps echoed through the room. Daniel stepped forward. "This is a coup. These are lies. I built this company." "You built nothing," Roman said, stepping out from the crowd. His voice was steady and cold. "I've been acquiring Shaw Industries debt for 18 months. As of this morning, I am the majority creditor, and I am calling in the loans." "You can't do this," Daniel sputtered. "I already have," Roman said, handing a document to the chairman. "Shaw Industries is now under the control of a restructuring committee. You're out, Daniel." Daniel spun toward Elena, his face red with rage. "This was you," he hissed. "You did this." Elena stepped forward. The room was silent, watching. "You didn't think I would fight back?" Elena said, her voice clear and calm. "You thought I was just a stepping stone, a casserole maker. Someone too stupid to understand what you were doing." She moved closer until she was standing right in front of him. "You ignored my calls when I was dying. You took my children from my arms. You tried to destroy everyone who helped me. You thought you'd already won." Her voice dropped, meant only for him. "You forgot I was an accountant, Daniel, and accountants always find the missing money." The ballroom doors swung open, and 2 FBI agents walked in. "Daniel Shaw," one of them said, "you are under arrest for tax fraud, money laundering, and conspiracy to commit custody interference." "You can't do this?" Daniel said again, but his voice was weak now, broken. The agents upped him some. Cameras flashed. The crowd watched in stunned silence as Daniel Shaw was led out of his own party in handcuffs. Elena watched him go. She didn't feel satisfaction or triumph, just a deep, bone-weary relief. It was over. The next morning, Elena picked up her children. Lucas was bigger. He had started to form simple words. When he saw Elena, his face lit up. "Mama," he said. Elena cried. She couldn't help it. Lily was quieter. She studied Elena's face for a long moment, as if making sure this was real. Then she reached up and touched her cheek. Elena held them both for a long time. She breathed in their scent, memorizing the weight of their small bodies against hers. Jess was there. Roman was there with Grace. Even Victoria had come, standing awkwardly at the edge of the room. "Thank you," Elena said to all of them. "I couldn't have done this alone." "That's the point," Jess said. "You were never supposed to do it alone." Roman crouched down so Grace could wave to Lucas and Lily. "What happens now?" Roman asked. Elena looked at her children, at the friends who had become her family, at the future that had finally stopped looking like a prison. "Now," Elena said, "we start over. For real this time." 1 year later, the sun was warm on the kitchen windows as Elena made breakfast for her twins. Lucas was 3 now, chattering about trucks and dinosaurs and the dog he wanted. But he was too young to have one. Lily was quieter, but she had started drawing, filling page after page with swirls of color that she gave to Elena like precious gifts. The house was modest compared to the Greenwich Mansion, a comfortable colonial in Westchester, with a backyard big enough for a swing set. Elena had bought it with money from her new company, Mercer Forensic Consulting. She founded it 6 months after the trial ended. The business was simple. She helped women in divorces find assets their husbands were trying to hide. The women who came to her were often desperate, frightened, and alone. Elena understood. She had been all of those things. "You saved me," one client told her. "I thought there was no way out." "There is always a way out," Elena replied, "but sometimes you need help finding it." The doorbell rang. Roman stood on the porch with Grace holding his hand. She was 4 now and chattered constantly, just like Lucas. She had her father's gray eyes and her mother's curly hair. "Morning," Roman said. Grace wanted to play with the twins before school. Elena smiled. "Come on in. The coffee is ready." They had settled into an easy routine over the past year. It wasn't romantic, not exactly, but something deeper, something that felt like family. Roman helped Elena with childcare when she had late meetings. Elena helped Roman with the challenges of being a single father. They celebrated holidays together, complained about school pickup lines together, and supported each other through the hard days. If it ever became something more than that, neither of them was in a hurry. There was now time to heal, time to grow, and time to figure out what they actually wanted. "Any word from the prosecutor?" Roman asked as Elena poured coffee. "Final sentencing is next month." Elena handed him a mug. "Daniel is looking at 8 to 12 years, and Margaret is already serving 15. She's appealing, of course, but Victoria's testimony was devastating. Victoria had been granted immunity in exchange for her full cooperation. She testified for 3 straight days, revealing everything she knew about Margaret's schemes and Daniel's part in them. The jury was only out for 4 hours. Elena still wasn't sure how she felt about Victoria. She was grateful, certainly, but forgiveness was harder. Some wounds just took longer to heal. "What about the children?" Roman asked carefully. "Has Daniel tried to contact them?" "His lawyer sent a letter," Elena admitted, "requesting visitation after he's released. And I haven't decided yet." She looked out the window at Lucas and Lily, who were playing with Grace in the backyard. "They don't remember him." "Not really. Lucas was 3 months old when it all happened. Lily was even younger. Maybe that's for the best." "Maybe," Roman said. Elena sighed. "But they'll have questions someday. They'll want to know about their father, and you'll tell them the truth. Some of it. Enough of it." Elena turned back to Roman. "I don't want them growing up hating him. Hate is too heavy to carry." Roman was quiet for a moment. Then he reached across the table and squeezed her hand. "You're a good mother," he said. "Better than you give yourself credit for. Elena smiled, a real smile, the kind she hadn't been able to manage a year ago. "I'm trying," she said. "That's all any of us can do." That afternoon, after Roman and Grace went home and the twins were napping, Elena sat in her home office reviewing client files. Her phone buzzed. It was a text from Jess. "Happy anniversary. 1 year since you took down the empire. How does it feel?" Elena typed back, "Like I can finally breathe." Jess responded with party emojis. "Dinner Friday? I've got stories about my latest case." Jess had started her own firm too, Torres Family Law. She specialized in high-conflict custody cases, using everything she learned from Elena's nightmare. She was helping other women navigate the system. "Definitely," Elena replied. "Usual place? Perfect. Bring wine." Elena set her phone down and looked around the office. Photos of the twins covered one wall. Her degrees hung on another. A small plaque sat on her desk, a gift from Jess that read, "Still standing. A year ago, she'd been sleeping on a friend's couch, her babies taken, her name destroyed." She had lost everything. Now she ran a company that helped other women avoid what happened to her. She had her children and friends who became family. She had a life that she had built with her own hands. She had learned something important. You don't need a man to save you, but you do need a team. Find your people, fight like hell, and never, ever stop. Elena smiled and turned back to her work. The afternoon sun streamed through the window. In the backyard, a cardinal landed on the fence and sang. And for the first time in longer than she could remember, Elena felt at peace. The story should have ended there, but life rarely ends where we expect it to. 3 weeks later, Elena was in her office when her assistant knocked on the door. "There's a new client," the assistant said. "She wants a consultation. Says it's urgent." Elena looked at her calendar. She had an opening. Send her in. The woman who entered was not what Elena expected. She was maybe 35, elegant in a simple way, with dark hair and tired eyes. She moved carefully, like someone who had been hurt and was still healing. "Mrs. Mercer," the woman said, "thank you for seeing me on such short notice. Please sit down." Elena gestured to a chair. "How can I help you?" The woman sat and folded her hands in her lap. Her wedding ring caught the light. "My name is Claire," she said. "Claire Kalinowski." Elena felt her heart stop. Claire Kalinowski, Roman's wife, the woman who had died of cancer 3 years ago. The woman whose loss had broken Roman's heart and left Grace without a mother. But Claire was sitting across from Elena's desk, very much alive. "I know this is a shock," Claire continued quietly. "Everyone thinks I'm dead. Roman believes I'm dead. He held a funeral for me. He mourned me, moved on. How?" Elena managed to ask. Claire took a deep breath. 3 years ago, I was diagnosed with an aggressive brain tumor. The prognosis was terminal, 6 months at most. But then, a federal agent contacted me. Roman's company was under investigation for money laundering, for old business dealings before we were married. The agent said I had 2 choices: testify against my husband and go into witness protection, or refuse and spend my last months watching the feds tear apart our lives. Elena stared at her. "I thought I was dying anyway," Claire said. "I thought I was protecting Roman and Grace by disappearing. So I agreed. I gave my testimony. They faked my death and put me in witness protection. But you didn't die. No. Against all odds. The treatment worked. I went into remission. But by then, I was legally dead. Roman had mourned me. Grace didn't remember me. I told myself they were better off without me. So why come forward now?" "Because Roman is in love with you," Claire said simply. "I've been watching from a distance, keeping track of his life. I saw how he helped you, how close you two have become. And I realized he deserves to know the truth. You both do." Elena sat back in her chair, her mind racing. Roman's wife was alive. The woman he had grieved for 3 years was sitting in her office, asking for help. "What do you want me to do?" Elena asked. "I want you to tell him," Claire said. I know it should come from me, but I can't just show up at his door. He'll think he's losing his mind. It needs to come from someone he trusts." Elena looked at the woman across from her. She saw the fear in Claire's eyes, the hope, the desperate need to reconnect with the life she had lost. She thought about Roman, about Grace, about the fragile happiness they had all built over the past year. She thought about what this revelation would do to all of them. And she made a decision. "I will tell him," Elena said. "But then you need to explain yourself. You owe him that." Claire nodded, tears running down her cheeks. "Thank you," she whispered. Elena looked at her calendar, at the photos of her children, at the life she had rebuilt from the ashes. She had thought her story was over. She had thought she had found peace, but she should have known better. When you dance with billionaires, the music never really stops. There was always another secret, another twist, another chapter waiting to be written. Elena picked up her phone to call Roman. The next story was about to begin. "So, now I have to ask you, what would you have done? Would you have trusted Roman, the man your husband hated most? Would you have fought back, even when the whole world believed his lies?" Drop a comment below. Tell me your story, because I read every single one. And I know some of you have been through something just like this. If this story reminded you of someone you love, a sister, a friend, a daughter, please share it with them. You never know whose life you might change with a single link. And if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button and tap the bell, because we've got more stories coming. Stories about women who refuse to stay down. Remember, you are stronger than you know. Your story isn't over. Until next time, stay strong.